Welcome to episode 4 of the Ulysses Unlocked podcast, where we analyze Ulysses by James Joyce one page at a time. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. And hello and welcome to The Deep Dive. Today we're taking, a real magnifying glass to page 6 of James Joyce's huge work, Ulysses. And this isn't just about, reading a page. It's really about uncovering the incredible density of meaning, the sharp wit, the profound historical context, and the artistic statements that Joyce packs into just a few lines. Our mission today, as we get into the sources you provided, is to navigate this really complex interplay between the characters and their environment, and to see how those very intimate reflections speak to larger themes throughout the entire novel.
Indeed. And what we encounter here so early on in the narrative, it truly serves as a kind of microcosm of Ulysses itself. You have this seemingly simple exchange between Stephen and Buck Mulligan, but it just rapidly expands to cover, everything from mental health, the very nature of art, national identity, and the really complex concept of self. We'll be pulling apart literary allusions that, they span from Shakespeare right through to Oscar Wilde, and exploring concepts from ancient Greek philosophy to Victorian social critique. It really raises an important question for us and for you listening. How much richness, how much profound insight can one single page truly give us when we really commit to digging deep?
It's just incredible, isn't it? A testament to Joyce's genius.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this page then and discover just how much he's hidden for us right here at the beginning, really setting the stage for everything that's going to follow.
The cutting edge of words, insults, identity, and illness.
Okay, so we start with a pretty jarring moment, almost brutal really, right there on page 6. Buck Mulligan, he's just come from the Ship Pub, which, for anyone curious about the Dublin geography, was a real hotel and tavern at 5 Abbey Street Lower. And he immediately throws this really loaded accusation at Stephen. He just says, "You have g.p.i." Now, this isn't just a casual insult, is it? It feels like a verbal weapon, steeped in some really unsettling history and medical context.
You're absolutely right. It's loaded. GPI stands for General Paresis of the Insane. It sounds quite polite, almost clinical, but in reality, it refers to tertiary syphilis, which is a late-stage form of the disease.
Yeah.
And this condition, it directly attacks the central nervous system, leading to just devastating neurological and psychiatric symptoms.
Wow. So not just a minor ailment then.
Not at all. And you have to remember, before the miracle of penicillin arrived in the 20th century, a GPI diagnosis was essentially a death sentence. It was 100% fatal, and it was responsible for filling countless beds in psychiatric hospitals. Think about Dublin's Richmond Lunatic Asylum, for instance. Locals had this grim nickname for it, Dottyville.
Dottyville. Yeah, that nickname alone paints a vivid, if pretty disturbing picture of the social anxiety around mental illness back then.
Oh.
So this wasn't some rare, obscure disease. It sounds like it was a pervasive, terrifying public health issue.
Oh, it absolutely was. General paresis, or sometimes called paralytic dementia, it was first really identified and studied back in the early 19th century. Initially, there was this rather harsh societal belief, quite common at the time, that it stemmed from, moral failings, a judgment often cast on people suffering from mental illness.
The usual blaming the victim kind of thing.
Exactly. But then by the 1880s, medical science finally established a clear, irrefutable link to syphilis, a biological cause. But even with that scientific understanding, the moral stigma, unfortunately, it just persisted. And before effective treatments like penicillin came along, the progression of GPI was horrifying. Profound mental deterioration, leading eventually to paralysis and then, inevitably, death. It tragically filled psychiatric wards. Dublin's Richmond Lunatic Asylum, which was set up back in 1815 mainly for the city's poor folks with mental illness, was certainly full of cases. Today, I think it's known as the Grange Gorman Mental Hospital. It's gone through a few changes.
And were there any notable figures trying to improve things at the Richmond Asylum? It's easy to just imagine it as this place of total despair, but maybe there were people trying to make a difference?
Yes, there certainly were. A figure like Connolly Norman, born 1853, died 1908. He was a very distinguished Irish alienist. That's the old term for a psychiatrist, you see. He served as the superintendent of the Richmond Asylum from 1886 right up to 1908. Norman was really dedicated to studying insanity, and crucially, he brought in significantly improved methods for the humane treatment of the insane during his time there.
Oh.
He really tried to bring a more scientific and compassionate approach to patient care, even with the limitations of the medicine back then. So yeah, despite its grim nickname and the terrifying illnesses inside, the asylum did see periods of more progressive care under his leadership.
That's important to remember, isn't it? That even in really bleak situations, individuals were striving for better. But let's get back to Mulligan's insult. Does the source material suggest if he meant it to carry that full, devastating weight? Or was there maybe a more casual slang meaning that might soften it a tiny bit?
That's an excellent question, and it gets to a really crucial bit of nuance here. Gifford, who's a well-known Joyce scholar, points out that among medical students in the British Isles, and that's Mulligan's crowd, right? That's g.p.i, was sometimes used as, well, slang for just being eccentric. Odd.
Oh, okay, so maybe just calling him weird.
Exactly. So on one level, Mulligan might just be calling Stephen peculiar or strange, and that detail does soften the insult somewhat. It suggests it might not have been a direct malicious accusation of, terminal syphilis. However, it's only a slight softening, really, when you consider the horrific literal meaning and the devastating impact of the actual condition. The shadow of its real meaning hangs heavy, even if it's said partly in jest.
And the sources mention that this insult specifically gets a sharper edge retrospectively for Joyce himself, connecting to very personal anxieties and experiences in his own family. That adds another layer entirely.
Precisely. This deepens the resonance of Mulligan's words enormously, linking them directly to these tragic medical problems that emerged later in Joyce's own family. Kathleen Ferris, a very insightful Joyce scholar, she presents this compelling argument that Joyce's daughter, Lucia, whose mental illness was diagnosed as schizophrenia in the 1930s, might actually have been suffering from syphilitic paresis, possibly transmitted in utero.
Wow, really?
Yeah. Ferris acknowledges that schizophrenia could explain many of Lucia's symptoms, but she argues that syphilitic paresis accounts for even more. And this claim becomes all the more poignant, heartbreaking even, because of Lucia's own reported statement to her father. Apparently, she told him that she had syphilis. Imagine hearing that as a father, especially given Mulligan's casual, cruel use of g.p.i. years earlier in his defining work.
God, that connection to Joyce's own family history is genuinely disturbing. It adds this raw, almost visceral layer to Mulligan's cruelty. Does this kind of pervasive anxiety about mental illness show up in more subtle ways in other characters, like Bloom, maybe? Beyond just the physical symptoms Ferris points out.
Oh, it absolutely does. It hints at this broader societal and personal vulnerability. Ferris meticulously links a whole range of symptoms seen in both Stephen and Bloom physical things like stiff walk, bad eyesight, digestive issues, but also more psychological experiences like hallucinations. She links these to what could be caused by syphilis. It suggests the subtle yet deeply pervasive undercurrent of physical and mental decay running through the novel's main characters. It implies their struggles aren't just, existential or intellectual, but they're also tied to the very real, often hidden problems of the body and mind that plagued society then. And think about Bloom's own anxieties, too, stemming from his father's suicide. They lead him to fear the committal of homicide or suicide during sleep by an aberration of the light of reason. That illustrates this deep-seated dread of inherited mental instability, a fear of losing control, which really echoes the societal terror of diseases like g.p.i.
That's a profound link to the novel's whole psychological landscape. So it seems like beyond just the specific fear of syphilis, Ulysses and Joyce's other writings have this constant preoccupation with mental imbalance, with vulnerability, almost like it's a defining feature of Irish life as he saw it.
It's definitely a recurring motif throughout his work. It reveals this consistent focus on the fragility of the human mind. If you look at the bigger picture, Joyce's stories are just filled with characters going through profound mental distress. Think about the mother in Eveline from Dubliners. She's remembered for her life of commonplace sacrifices closing in final craziness.
Right, I remember that line.
Or the really unsettling, disturbed old man in An Encounter. Even in a portrait, Stephen himself is haunted by the screeching of a mad nun in the nun's madhouse beyond the wall. And then in Ulysses itself, the canvas gets even more populated with figures showing clear signs of instability. Dennis Breen, obsessed with that nonsensical postcard, prone to public outbursts. And Cashel Boyle O'Connor Fitzmaurice Tisdall Farrell, who other characters just dismissively called Dotty Farrell. These aren't just random details. They form this pervasive backdrop of psychological vulnerability that Joyce explores so masterfully. It makes Mulligan's initial insult not just a personal attack, but this resonant echo of a societal anxiety that's deeply embedded in the fabric of his fictional world.
So this g.p.i. insult is way more than just a crude comment. It's this multi-layered weapon carrying deep personal meaning for Joyce and tapping into a vein of profound anxieties woven through the whole novel. But Stephen's immediate reaction to this cruel attack is just as revealing, isn't it? It gives us this intimate look into his internal world.
Absolutely. Mulligan, who seems utterly relentless in his taunting, then sweeps the mirror right toward Stephen, saying, "Look at yourself," he said, "you dreadful bard." Stephen, sort of forced to confront his own image, peers into this cracked surface, and he sees his hair on end. And the internal monologue that follows is just raw, unfiltered. "As he and others see me, who chose this face for me, this dog's body to rid of vermin, it asks me too." This inner thought process directly references Robert Burns' famous poem, To a Louse, specifically those incredibly self-reflective lines. "Oh, what some power the giftie gie us, to see ourselves as others see us. It would from money a blunder free us, and foolish notion."
Oh, the Burns connection. That's incredibly poignant. It instantly shows Stephen's acute self-awareness and maybe his intense self-consciousness, too. He's wrestling not just with how Mulligan sees him, but with that broader, almost universal human wish to understand how we really appear to the world.
Indeed. Stephen's inner monologue here is like a window straight into his deep insecurity and the perceived burden of his physical state. He feels unwashed, badly clothed, and importantly, lice-infested, captured vividly in that phrase, "dog's body to rid of vermin." And the term dog's body itself, it's British slang for a servant who does all the menial, unpleasant tasks. It instantly highlights his low self-worth right then.
Right.
And this feeling of being a dog's body, it resonates with the skivvy, that low-status servant we'll hear about next, from whom the mirror was stolen. It links Stephen's own internal sense of his low status to the very real, demeaning reality of the servant class in Dublin. He feels like he's not just physically messy, but almost an object of disgust, only useful for, unpleasant chores.
And that question, who chose this face for me?
Yeah.
It feels like more than just complaining about his looks, doesn't it? It seems to probe something much deeper about identity, about agency.
It probes the very core of his being, really. That question speaks to a profound existential struggle Stephen is facing about his identity, his self-determination. He's grappling with that timeless philosophical question, free will versus destiny. He feels trapped not just by his current situation, but by his very physical form, which he sees as something arbitrarily given to him, totally beyond his control. It's a moment that just perfectly captures his deep internal conflict, this struggle to assert his individuality and artistic vision in a world that seems bent on diminishing him. It's a conflict that echoes throughout his whole journey in the novel. He wants self-creation but feels subjected to some external, almost cruel design.
It's a moment of raw, introspective vulnerability, and it's perfectly placed against Mulligan's relentless, increasingly personal taunting. He just keeps twisting the knife, doesn't he?
Mulligan, seemingly immune to any shred of restraint or empathy, then compounds his earlier cruelty by revealing where the mirror came from. He stole it from the skivvy's room in his parents' house. Now, for context, a skivvy or sleevey, that was a maid-of-all-work, a very low-status female domestic servant. She'd be tasked with the most menial, toughest household jobs, often working alone and getting little respect.
Right, the lowest of the low in household staff.
Exactly. And to deepen the insult, Mulligan disparagingly calls her plain-looking, and then with just blatant blasphemy, he jokes, "Lead him not into temptation." And her name is Ursula. This is a direct sacrilegious borrowing from the Lord's Prayer, Matthew 6.13, and "lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil."
So he's not just mocking the vulnerability of this low-status servant. He's mocking piety itself at the same time, twisting his sacred prayer into a crude joke. And Ursula, that name, it actually carries a surprising amount of historical and legendary baggage, doesn't it?
It really does. It adds another layer of complex irony to Mulligan's seemingly casual comment. Saint Ursula is this legendary early Christian saint, famous for her, almost fanatical hatred of marriage and her unwavering commitment to virginity. The legend, which really took off in the medieval period, says she led this pilgrimage of 11,000 virgins across Europe to honor their shared vow of chastity.
11,000.
I know. This huge procession, according to the legend, ended with her and all her companions being martyred at Cologne. The actual year of her martyrdom is a bit fuzzy in the historical accounts. Some say AD 237, others 283, some even 451, which just highlights the legendary rather than strictly historical nature of the whole story.
11,000 virgins is just an astonishingly, almost unbelievably huge number for any pilgrimage, let alone a martyrdom. It really strains belief. Is there any scholarly theory about how that number came about?
Well, scholarly theories offer a pretty fascinating explanation for this seemingly fantastic number. If the legend has any tiny kernel of historical truth, it's thought that this truly impressive and frankly improbable figure of martyred virgins probably came from a misreading, likely in the 9th century, of historical records going back to the 5th century.
A typo, essentially.
Sort of. One really compelling idea is that the abbreviation XIMV, which might have originally meant 11 martyred virgins, got wrongly interpreted as 11,000 virgins because M is the Roman numeral for 1,000.
I see. Makes sense.
And Joyce himself, with his usual deep knowledge and mischievous wit, clearly knew about and played with this historical exaggeration. He actually alludes to this inflated number in the Cyclops episode of Ulysses, where a comical procession ends with S. Ursula with 11,000 virgins. It just shows his awareness of, and probably amusement at, the legend's sheer scale.
That's a brilliant little detail.
Right.
It shows Joyce's deep knowledge and his willingness to pack even minor details with humor and historical irony, much like Mulligan is doing here, though Mulligan's doing it with irreverent mockery.
Precisely. Mulligan's anti-clericalism is just on full, brazen display here. Thornton, in his analysis, points out that Alban Butler's really influential Lives of the Saints presented Ursula as a model and patroness specifically for training young people in piety and religious devotion. Mulligan, with his casual blasphemy and crude joke about temptation, represents a direct confrontational rejection of that kind of conventional religious discipline and moral teaching.
Right.
So this specific mockery of Ursula isn't just a dig at a servant. It really highlights his atheistic blasphemy over religious piety. It overtly shows his profound disdain for conventional religious values and the social repression he clearly associates with them. He's using the sacred to ridicule, further cementing this rebellious, anti-establishment persona he cultivates.
The cracked canvas art, reality, and Irish identity.
Mulligan, never one to just let an insult fade, then escalates his verbal attack even further, pulling in another literary giant, Oscar Wilde. He proclaims, "The rage of Caliban at not seeing his face in a mirror if Wilde were only alive to see you." This really takes the personal attack onto a more sophisticated, intellectual, and frankly, quite devastating level.
Yes, and what's truly fascinating here is how Mulligan, despite his, general boorishness, actually wields these literary allusions quite skillfully. He layers insult upon insult. He uses this sophisticated reference to demean Stephen's physical state while at the same time critiquing his artistic sensibilities. This line is a direct paraphrase from the preface, which is itself a brilliant prose poem to Oscar Wilde's major work, The Picture of Dorian Gray, published in 1891. Wilde famously used Caliban, the evil-natured brute from Shakespeare's The Tempest, as this potent symbol for the common 19th century Philistine mentality, those people resistant to the idea of art for art's sake.
Okay, so if Wilde used Caliban to represent the Philistines, what exactly did he mean by the rage of Caliban in relation to art and reality? It seems like a pretty complex statement.
Wilde's meaning, which he laid out in that famous preface, is quite nuanced. He gives this dual definition of literary dislike. He wrote, "The 19th century dislike of realism is the rage of Caliban seeing his own face in a glass. The 19th century dislike of romanticism is the rage of Caliban not seeing his own face in a glass."
Okay, unpack that a bit.
So what he meant was that the unenlightened middle class, the Philistines, those lacking aesthetic appreciation, were like Caliban. When realistic art, especially the really gritty naturalism of writers like Émile Zola, dared to show humanity in all its raw imperfection, these readers were outraged by an ugliness they recognized, maybe subconsciously an ugliness mirroring their own lives. That's Caliban seeing his own face.
Yeah.
Conversely, when romantic art presented avant-garde visions that didn't perfectly mirror their conventional, often sanitized reality, they protested because they couldn't relate to it, couldn't find themselves reflected in it. That's Caliban not seeing his own face. Wilde was basically critiquing this narrow-mindedness that judged art not on its aesthetic quality, but purely on whether it flattered or confirmed their existing worldview.
And Mulligan, with his typical cruelty, is applying this entire complex framework to Stephen, suggesting Stephen himself is this Caliban figure, both savage and somehow deluded.
Precisely. Mulligan implies that Stephen, in his unwashed, lice-infested, and poorly clothed state, is the savage Caliban, yet, ironically, he's blind to his own reflection, unable to truly see how wretched he looks. Mulligan suggests that Stephen's romantic self-image blinds him to the reality of his condition. He's effectively casting Stephen as a baffled object of representation, not the knowing creator of art that Stephen longs to be. It's a really cutting remark, designed to wound Stephen right where he's most vulnerable: his physical appearance, his self-perception, and his artistic dreams. Mulligan isn't offering helpful criticism here. It's sharp, intellectually barbed mockery. He's using Wilde as a literary weapon to basically reiterate Stephen's own earlier internal thought. as he and others see me. He's weaponizing culture against Stephen's very being.
So Mulligan's essentially calling Stephen a deluded savage, blind to both his own physical reality and any kind of artistic truth. But Stephen, with this remarkable, almost painful calm, manages to take that very mirror, that very insult, and turn it into a declaration of his own artistic philosophy. What exactly does he mean by the cracked looking-glass of a servant?
Stephen, with this sort of bitterness that barely hides his pain, responds, "It is a symbol of Irish art, the cracked looking-glass of a servant." This is a hugely pivotal statement, just dense with layers of meaning and allusion. It articulates Stephen's really complex artistic philosophy. To really get the weight of it, you have to think back to Shakespeare's Hamlet and his famous lines about drama holding as 'twere the mirror up to nature. That symbolizes art as this faithful, mimetic reflection of external reality. Stephen's phrase consciously plays on that idea, but with a crucial twist.
Right, so Hamlet's mirror reflects reality perfectly, but Stephen's mirror, the one symbolizing Irish heart, is cracked. What does that cracked part signify specifically in the Irish context?
That cracked aspect is absolutely critical. It suggests that this kind of straightforward, mimetic, truth-telling representation is profoundly difficult, maybe even impossible, or at the very least, inevitably distorted when you're working within the confines of colonial subjection. Irish art, under the heavy weight of colonial rule, simply cannot perfectly reflect a whole, unblemished reality because reality itself is fragmented, oppressed, made unwhole by foreign domination.
I see.
So the mirror isn't just cracked by accident. Its imperfection is a direct result of the damaged state of the nation itself. And furthermore, the fact that the mirror belongs to a servant, a skivvy, as we discussed, that reinforces the low status, the subservience, the lack of grandeur given to Irish art and artists in a colonized land. They aren't grandmasters holding up some perfect gold-framed mirror to an ideal society. They're struggling in humble, often demeaning circumstances, and their tools are as humble and damaged as their nation.
That's a really powerful and deeply political statement about the inherent limits of art under colonial oppression. And this resonates directly with Joyce's own artistic stance, doesn't it? Especially concerning his passionate fight to get Dubliners published, where he aimed to hold up a mirror, even if he called his a nicely polished one.
Absolutely. This statement is fundamental to Joyce's artistic mission. When he was living outside Ireland, battling to get Dubliners printed against huge resistance, Joyce famously wrote to his publisher, Grant Richards. He said, with this almost defiant conviction, "It is not my fault that the odor of ash pits and old weeds and offal hangs around my stories. I seriously believe that you will retard the course of civilization in Ireland by preventing the Irish people from having one good look at themselves in my nicely polished looking glass." Joyce firmly believed that fiction had this moral, this artistic duty to represent human reality accurately, unflinchingly, with all its paralyzing flaws, precisely to show Caliban his face in a mirror. He saw his art as a crucial way to liberate the Irish from ignorance, from complacency, from self-delusion, by forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. Now, Stephen, at this specific point in Ulysses, he hasn't yet achieved that kind of searing, honest portrayal in his own writing. His despair in Dublin includes this deep doubt that he can truly represent Ireland while he feels trapped inside it. Though, interestingly, by the end of the Aeolus episode, we see him resolve to try, perhaps taking up Joyce's own artistic challenge.
So Stephen's cracked looking glass of a servant becomes his declaration of an art form that openly admits its own limitations and the damage imposed by its colonial context, even as it struggles to reflect some kind of fundamental truth. But there's an alternative interpretation, tying back to Wilde again, that complicates this view, suggesting something maybe even more profound about what art is.
Yes. This is where the layers really deepen and perhaps even contradict each other, inviting us and inviting you listening to grapple with artistic ambiguity. Stuart Gilbert, in his foundational 1930 study, James Joyce's Ulysses, pointed out an additional context for the cracked looking glass that might not just complicate, but maybe even challenge that reading of Joyce's realism we just discussed.
Okay.
In Oscar Wilde's brilliant dialogue essay, The Decay of Lying, published back in 1889, Wilde explicitly uses the phrase cracked looking glass to object to the whole idea that art should merely mirror external reality. Wilde, as a committed romantic, championed the belief in individual genius of view the literary critic M.H. Abrams calls the lamp view of art. The idea is that the artist's internal vision radiates its own light and is inherently more valuable, more truthful than any conventional external reality.
Right. So if Stephen is repeating Wilde's phrase word for word, and Mulligan has just brought up Wilde, Could it mean that Irish art isn't trying to perfectly reflect a damaged reality, but is actually trying to creatively distort or transform it, kind of in line with Wilde's anti-mimetic stance, where art actually creates reality?
That is a very sharp interpretation, and it opens up a fascinating and really powerful alternative reading. The fact that Stephen repeats Wilde's phrase verbatim right after Mulligan has invoked another work by the same author strongly suggests this anti-mimetic reading of Stephen's sentence. From this angle, Irish art isn't seen as a direct, even a flawed reflection of an external world, but rather as an active, subjective creation that prioritizes the artist's imaginative vision over mere conventional external reality. It implies that art, in this Wildean sense, might be considered the true reality, and life just its mirror, as Wilde's character Vivian argues in that essay. So Stephen's phrase becomes this remarkably ambiguous, potent statement. It holds both the pain of colonial distortion and the revolutionary potential for artistic transformation and creation. It's a moment where the personal, the political, and the aesthetic just collide in one unforgettable line.
Wow. Okay, so this single phrase, the cracked looking glass of a servant, gives us two powerful, possibly conflicting ways to understand Stephen's artistic mission. It's just a testament to Joyce's incredible layering of meaning. But what does this whole escalating verbal fight mean for the basic tension between Stephen and Mulligan, especially when we think about the actual objects Mulligan is carrying?
The dance of daggers, rivalry, and betrayal.
Right. The physical objects Mulligan carries, his razor and mirror clacking in the pocket where he had thrust them, they are far from just random props. They become these potent, almost menacing symbols of the deeply complex and increasingly hostile relationship between these two men. These objects are just loaded with meaning, signaling danger and deception.
You mentioned earlier that the mirror and razor were crossed at one point in the narrative. That detail certainly feels like it carries some heavy symbolic weight, suggesting more than just chance.
It absolutely does. It sets an immediate, almost unsettling tone right from the start. The fact that the mirror and razor lay crossed earlier, who bleakly announces that Mulligan will soon be parodying a Catholic priest celebrating Mass. So that sets up this immediate undercurrent of irreverence, of sacrilege, further highlighting Mulligan's contempt for religious institutions. But beyond just this religious parody, these objects clearly signal a deeper, much more personal conflict between them. The razor, especially, carries this chilling weight. It represents a direct physical threat. And remember, Mulligan repeatedly calls Stephen by that brutal nickname Kinch, explaining its origin with unsettling specificity. "Oh, my name for you is the best. Kinch, the knife blade."
Kinch the knife blade, yeah, that's a deeply disturbing nickname. It suggests maybe a sharpness or intellectual edge to Stephen, but it also implies he's vulnerable, almost like Mulligan sees him as something to be cut, dissected even. It says a lot about Mulligan's character.
It says volumes, yes. It firmly associates Mulligan with this casual, almost detached brutality. Remember, he's a medical student. He has routinely seen corpses cut up into tripes in the dissecting room. This gives him this chilling familiarity with violence, with dissection, maybe a certain lack of reverence for the human body. We also see him lunging bread impaled on his knife towards his friends in this crude, aggressive way.
Right.
And he consciously mimics figures of antagonism from literature and myth, acting like Antinous and Claudius from Homer and Shakespeare, characters known for carrying concealed weapons, looking for opportunities to do harm. This consistent imagery just firmly establishes Mulligan as this menacing figure, capable of both physical aggression and sharp intellectual violence. And Stephen is acutely aware of this threat.
So Stephen clearly sees this rivalry not just as a war of words, but as this deeply personal, potentially dangerous duel between them, almost like an artistic and intellectual combat zone.
Precisely. Stephen perceives this rivalry with an acute, almost visceral understanding. He recognizes it as a battle for intellectual and artistic dominance, a duel of wills. He internalizes his observations, thinking, parried again. He fears the lancet of my art as I fear that of his, the cold steel pen. This is a profoundly articulate thought, laying bare the nature of their conflict. It's a duel between Mulligan's sharp, cutting wit and his brutal, dissecting nature symbolized by the surgeon's lancet and the physical razor, versus Stephen's artistic, intellectual power, symbolized by the precise, enduring, cold steel pen.
Oh.
Their seemingly friendly embrace that is anything but genial when Mulligan hooks his arm in Stephen's is deeply deceptive. It just masks this story of rising hatred that underpins every single exchange they have. The constant clacking of that razor and mirror in Mulligan's pocket serves as this persistent, subtle, ominous reminder of the underlying unspoken conflict. It's a constant threat just beneath the surface of their strained interaction.
It's a battle of wits and wills, then. where even a seemingly friendly gesture, like linking arms, hides this deeper antagonism and the unspoken threat of violence. That constant clacking of the objects is like a subtle, ominous soundtrack to their whole relationship. And it's right in this moment of intense friction, this internal conflict, that Stephen's thoughts drift, maybe involuntarily, to another significant figure from his past, Cranley.
Indeed. In this highly charged moment, thick with this barely hidden hostility and growing hatred, Stephen notes with this poignant sense of recognition Cranley's arm. His arm. This isn't just a random thought, it's a deeply meaningful memory. It consciously links Mulligan's current gesture of linking arms with Stephen to his past friendship now estranged with Cranley and Elam. A portrait of the artist as a young man. Cranley was such a pivotal figure in Stephen's intellectual and emotional growth, a confidant, sometimes a rival. The estrangement between them, which stemmed from profound philosophical and spiritual disagreements, makes this comparison to Mulligan a really bittersweet and heavily loaded one. It hints at Stephen's recurring experiences with betrayal and loneliness.
And the name Cranley itself, it carries significant historical weight, doesn't it? Adding another layer of depth to Stephen's internal thought, connecting his personal history to a much larger story of Irish political and church power.
It certainly does. The historical resonance of the name Cranley is powerful. Thomas Cranley, who lived from 1337 to 1417, was a highly influential Carmelite monk. He rose to become Archbishop of Dublin in 1397 and then later served as Lord Chancellor of Ireland, an incredibly powerful position. It's worth noting he didn't even officially get to Dublin until October 1398, after his appointment. So we're talking about a figure who held immense power over both the spiritual and the political life of the nation, a real embodiment of combined authority.
Wow, a single historical figure embodying both church and state authority. That combination seems incredibly significant for Stephen, given his own difficult relationship with both institutions in Ireland.
Precisely. The fusion of church and state authority in one man, Thomas Cranley, carries immense symbolic weight for Stephen. It subtly implies yet another Anglo-Irish betrayal. It connects a personal sense of abandonment and intellectual estrangement with this broader pattern of national subjugation and compromised authority that Stephen feels so acutely in his own life and sees in Irish history. It suggests that even the spiritual and intellectual leaders of Ireland have, at different times, been co-opted or tainted by external powers, leading to this profound sense of betrayal and a fragmented national identity. The memory of Cranley, his estranged friend, intertwines with this historical figure who held dual power, deepening Stephen's personal sense of abandonment within this larger narrative of national subjugation and disloyalty. For Stephen, it seems everything, even a simple linking of arms, gets filtered through the painful lens of Ireland's troubled past and his own personal betrayals.
So the ghost of a past friendship, layered with the historical weight of Anglo-Irish betrayal, adds another profound dimension to Stephen's already difficult present. It becomes crystal clear that for Stephen, every personal interaction, every internal thought is just inextricably linked to the complex, wounded state of Ireland itself.
The grand vision Hellenizes an Irish culture.
Okay, so amidst all these layers of insults, tension, historical echoes, Mulligan, surprisingly, delivers this grand proposition. It's almost a moment of shared, if maybe twisted, ambition. He declares, God, Kitch, if you and I could only work together, we might do something for the island. Hellenize it. That phrase, Hellenize it, really jumps out, doesn't it?
Indeed, that phrase, Hellenize it, is where we really pivot and connect with the broader intellectual currents swirling around in the late 19th century, particularly through the really influential theories of Matthew Arnold. Arnold, who was a prominent English poet and cultural critic, was the one who famously coined the verb to Hellenize. He did it in his effort to distinguish between what he saw as the two dominant and often opposing impulses driving Western culture. His work profoundly shaped how many intellectuals of that era thought about cultural development.
And what were these two fundamental impulses that Arnold identified so influentially in his analysis of Western civilization? What was the core distinction he was making?
Well, in his highly influential book, Culture and Anarchy, which first came out in 1869, Arnold meticulously distinguished between what he called Hebraism and Hellenism. For Arnold, Hebraism represented the impulse guided by revealed dogmatic truth. It emphasized strict religious discipline, moral correctness, and an unwavering adherence to rules and conscience. He saw English culture, particularly the Victorian middle class, as excessively Hebraic. He was critical of what he called the morally earnest middle-class Philistines, who prioritized conduct and a rigid sense of duty over intellectual curiosity and aesthetic appreciation. Hebraism, for Arnold, was primarily about doing the right thing.
Okay, so if Hebraism was about strict moral and religious adherence, almost a sense of duty and action, what then was Hellenism in Arnold's philosophical view? What was the counterbalance?
Hellenism, in stark contrast, represented the impulse to know truth disinterestedly, meaning objectively, without personal bias or prejudgment, through the free exercise of human reason and a flexible humanism. It emphasized intellectual and aesthetic pursuit, a love of beauty, clarity of thought, and spiritual enlightenment. Arnold believed that England, to achieve what he called total perfection and a more well-rounded national character, desperately needed to Hellenize itself. It needed to balance its excessive Hebraism with greater intellectual freedom and aesthetic sensitivity. Interestingly, Arnold himself was an agnostic but deeply admired religious contemporaries like John Henry Newman for their intellectual rigor. He saw Hellenism as a path to intellectual balance, not necessarily a rejection of deep thought itself. Arnold's distinction really informs statements throughout Ulysses about Greekness and Jewishness, and the novel's overall affirmation of human-centered values against rigid religious absolutism.
That's a truly fascinating intellectual background. It lays out this sophisticated framework for thinking about cultural development. But by the turn of the century, around 1904 when Ulysses is set, did Arnold's nuanced distinction still hold? Or had it sort of evolved, maybe simplified in the popular mind?
That's a key point. By the turn of the century, Arnold's essentially intellectual and philosophical distinction had gone through significant changes as it got popularized, often simplified, and sometimes even distorted. It frequently degenerated into this kind of black and white culture war between perceived repressive middle-class Philistines on one side and freedom-loving artistic bohemians on the other.
Ah, the classic culture war setup.
Exactly. Gifford insightfully notes that Greek became bohemian slang. It became synonymous with sensual aesthetic liberation and freedom, suggesting pleasure, beauty, and uninhibited lifestyle. Conversely, Jew became slang for antagonism towards aesthetic values, embodying straight-laced Victorian morality and social repression. So the terms shifted from being these nuanced philosophical concepts to becoming crude, often prejudiced cultural battle lines, just a shorthand for opposing worldviews, particularly in artistic and intellectual circles.
Right. So Mulligan isn't just dropping a random classical term. He's tapping into a very specific and highly charged cultural debate of the time, clearly putting himself on the Greek side of that divide. But given his character, does he really embody Arnold's original nuanced vision of Hellenism? Or is his interpretation maybe a bit more, shall we say, decadent?
Your intuition is spot on there. Mulligan, far from embracing Arnold's idea of intellectual balance, instead embodies the decadent fin de siècle interpretation of Hellenism. His version is decidedly Swinburnian, referencing the poet Algernon Charles Swinburne, known for his controversial, often hedonistic and anti-religious themes. Mulligan's Hellenism prioritizes flashy style over intellectual substance, hedonism over conventional morality, and atheistic blasphemy over religious piety. He shows absolutely none of Arnold's original interest in restoring cultural balance. For Mulligan, Hellenizing the island seems primarily about throwing off the perceived chains of a restrictive, pious Irish society in favor of unrestrained personal freedom and indulgence. He's advocating for a superficial liberation, not a deep intellectual one.
And we can certainly see that in his earlier, almost gleeful mockery of St. Ursula, the very symbol of virginity and piety, his contempt for traditional religious values is just palpable.
Exactly. His blasphemy and anti-clericalism are entirely consistent with this decadent brand of Hellenism. Later, in the Scylla and Charybdis episode, Mulligan explicitly praises the Greek mouth that has never been twisted in prayer. That reinforces his total rejection of religious piety and moral codes in favor of sensual and aesthetic freedom. His Hellenism is much less about rigorous intellectual exploration and much more about a libertine, uninhibited lifestyle, a direct challenge to the strict moral and religious climate of turn-of-the-century Dublin. He sees traditional prayer almost as a distortion of natural beauty and pleasure.
And there are even stronger hints, aren't there, that Mulligan's particular brand of Hellenism extends to a much broader interpretation of sensuality and liberation, even touching on sexual preferences, aligning with the more transgressive side of fin de siècle decadence.
Yes, the sources explicitly hint at this more radical dimension of Mulligan's Hellenism. They suggest he might also embrace the ancient Greek openness to choice of genders in sexual pursuits. This is hinted at most strongly, again, in the Scylla and Charybdis episode. There, Mulligan observes Bloom looking at a Greek goddess statue. Just a moment of aesthetic appreciation from Bloom, and Mulligan immediately infers forbidden kind of intercourse, provocatively declaring that Bloom is Greeker than the Greeks.
Right, that's a significant moment.
It's a real moment of projection for Mulligan. He also implies a certain sexual ambidexterity, warning Stephen with this mock-serious tone. I fear thee, ancient mariner. Oh, kench thou art in peril, get thee a breech pad. The breech pad here is this joking reference to protective gear worn by fencers, implying Stephen needs to guard himself from certain kinds of advances, hinting at the homosexual undertones that Mulligan attributes to this Hellenism.
So he's implying that Bloom, despite his conventional life and Jewish identity, is either engaging in or is capable of embracing this sensual, maybe even unconventional aspect of Hellenism. It's almost like Mulligan is trying to interpret Bloom through his own decadent lens.
Precisely. Mulligan is projecting his own interpretations onto Bloom, framing him within this liberated, perhaps sexually ambiguous understanding of Hellenism. And this theme gets underscored even more explicitly by Mulligan's sort of queeny, theatrical recounting of Edward Dowden's comments on Shakespeare and pederasty. Mulligan, with this flourish, says, "Lovely, Buck Mulligan suspired amorously. I asked him what he thought of the charge of pederasty brought against the bard. He lifted his hands and said, all we can say is that life ran very high in those days. Lovely." This flippant, almost celebratory discussion of pederasty is immediately followed by Stephen's internal thought, just the single loaded word, catamite, a term for a boy kept for homosexual purposes. This exchange unequivocally reinforces this aspect of sexual liberation and ambiguity as a core, maybe even central, part of Mulligan's particular decadent brand of Hellenism.
It really sounds like Mulligan's vision of Hellenizing the island is less about Matthew Arnold's intellectual and aesthetic balance and much more about a complete throwing off of all restraints, embracing a kind of hedonistic, almost anarchic freedom that challenges every social and sexual convention he can think of.
That is an exceptionally accurate way to put Mulligan's superficial and pretty self-serving interpretation. However, and this is where Joyce gets really profound and intellectually stimulating, Joyce deftly uses Mulligan's exaggerated, almost caricatured Hellenism to obliquely introduce a much deeper and more significant idea, the potential for a coincidence of contraries, a genuine synthesis of these two seemingly opposing cultural impulses. Joyce is never satisfied with simple opposites.
Right, so Joyce isn't just presenting a simple binary between Greek and Jew or Hellenism and Hebraism like maybe many of his contemporaries might have done. He's hinting at something much more complex, much more integrated.
Not a simple binary at all. The novel itself subtly, sometimes comically, and repeatedly hints that these two profound cultural impulses, far from being diametrically opposed, might actually coexist, combine, and even coincide in a remarkably enriching way. This concept gets articulated most explicitly in the wild, dreamlike Circe episode, where a Cap yells out, "Jew Greek is Greek Jew, extremes meet, death is the highest form of life." Bah! This coincidence of contraries isn't just a throwaway line. It is, in fact, a central organizing theme and a profound philosophical undercurrent running through the entire novel, informing its structure and character development.
And how is this fascinating synthesis, this Jew Greek is Greek Jew, most powerfully shown through the novel's main characters, Stephen Dedalus and Leopold Bloom? They seem on the surface to embody these very different traditions.
Their convergence, their coming together, is the most compelling manifestation of this synthesis. The journey of the book's two principal characters, Stephen Dedalus and Leopold Bloom, represents this coincidence of contraries. Stephen is primarily associated with Hellenism through his Paris fads, his ancient Greek names, Dedalus echoing Daedalus the craftsman, his principled intellect, his pursuit of aesthetic truth, and his profound rejection of his mother's traditional Irish piety and the Catholic Church.
Right.
Bloom, on the other hand, while outwardly dressing and acting like a conventional middle-class Dubliner, becomes deeply identified with the ancient archetype of the wandering Jew. His relentlessly practical and moral sensibility, his capacity for empathy, his groundedness, these contrast starkly with Stephen's high intellectual and aesthetic disregard for such pragmatic things, even though Bloom, like Stephen, has also moved away from strict religious practice. To the extent that some uncanny, almost spiritual father-son unity is eventually realized between these two profoundly different men, then Jew-Greek is indeed Greek-Jew. Their combined identities, experiences, perspectives, they embody this synthesis. They create something richer, more complete, more human than either extreme alone could offer. And this becomes a vision for a more integrated whole Ireland.
So while Mulligan is championing this superficial hedonistic Hellenism, Joyce is subtly but powerfully building a narrative where these two seemingly opposite forces, The intellectual and the moral, the aesthetic and the practical can actually merge and enrich each other to create a more integrated and complete identity, not just for his protagonist, but maybe for the nation itself.
And it's crucial to understand that even though Joyce found Matthew Arnold a significant literary inspiration for liberating the souls of his countrymen, he also subjected Arnold to some mockery as a stuffy English gentleman of the previous generation. It's a classic Joycean move. Appreciate the intellectual substance, but satirize the personality or the perceived limitations.
So Joyce admired Arnold's groundbreaking ideas, but he wasn't above poking fun at his rather prim Victorian persona. How exactly does he do that? Through what kind of imagery?
Joyce uses very specific, often quite amusing imagery to poke fun at Arnold. He frequently trivializes him alongside figures he considered similarly dated or overly formal, like Lon Tennyson, gentleman poet. For instance, in the Telemachus episode, when Stephen imagines the scene at Magdalen College, Oxford, a bastion of English intellectual tradition, he places Arnold right in it. A deaf gardener, aproned, masked with Matthew Arnold's face, pushes his mower on the somber lawn, watching narrowly the dancing motes of grass halms.
Masked with Matthew Arnold's face.
Exactly. And later, in the surreal, dreamlike Circe episode, the image comes back with this comedic twist. The Siamese twins, Philip drunk and Philip sober, two Oxford dons with lawnmowers, appear in the window embrasure. Both are masked with Matthew Arnold's face. Gifford insightfully observes that Arnold's emphasis on restraint, poise, and taste was regarded as Philistinism incarnate by turn-of-the-century aesthetes, even though many of their terms and intellectual frameworks, ironically, came directly from Arnold himself. So Joyce could simultaneously appreciate the profound intellectual foundation Arnold laid while playfully lampooning the perceived primness, the staidness, or the Philistinism of the man and the era he represented. It's a complex, nuanced critique acknowledging influence while asserting his own artistic independence.
That's a brilliant and very Joycean way to show both respect for the intellectual contribution and a playful, irreverent critique of the messenger. But when we connect this back to the bigger picture of Ireland, how profound was this idea of Hellenizing the island in its post-independence context, especially given the actual path Ireland took after Joyce was writing?
This is perhaps one of the most crucial points for understanding Joyce's broader, almost prophetic message. The deep, often unfulfilled importance of Hellenizing the island can be starkly seen by looking at the path Ireland took in the decades after it won its hard-fought independence from Britain. The policies of the Irish Free State and the early Republic, which were notoriously conservative, sexually repressive, and slavishly deferential to the dictates of Catholic authorities, they clearly demonstrate that the excessive Hebraism of Irish society wasn't solely a product of colonial subjugation.
That's a key point. It was internal, too.
It was an internal, deeply entrenched cultural and social force. This pervasive moral and religious conservatism stifled intellectual and aesthetic freedom. Joyce, even while his occasional playful mockery of Matthew Arnold might superficially hide it, found in Arnold one vital literary inspiration for liberating the souls of his countrymen. He saw the profound, urgent need for the intellectual and aesthetic liberation that true Hellenism offered, a liberation that went far, far beyond Mulligan's superficial hedonistic interpretation. It was about forging a balanced, enlightened, critical, and truly free-thinking society, rather than one shackled by dogma, religious repression, and cultural narrowness. It was a vision that, tragically, remained largely unfulfilled in the early decades of independent Ireland.
It really seems Joyce was acutely aware that Ireland needed its own profound cultural rebalancing, a Hellenizing that aimed for a deeper, more comprehensive societal transformation, not just Mulligan's hedonistic surface. He truly saw art as a path towards national self-realization, didn't he? Outro. Wow. What an incredible deep dive we've taken into just a few lines from Ulysses, page 6. We started with Buck Mulligan's crude insult about g.p.i, and as we dug deeper into the sources, uncovered this complex web of medical history, Joyce's own deeply personal anxieties, and the novel's broader pervasive landscape of psychologically vulnerable characters. We then explored the profound implications of Stephen's defiant declaration, the cracked looking glass of a servant, navigating sophisticated Wildean allusions, and revealing Joyce's own artistic manifesto for Ireland, which, as we learned, encompasses both realistic and anti-mimetic views of what art should do. Finally, we meticulously unpacked Mulligan's audacious call to Hellenize it, tracing its intellectual journey from Matthew Arnold's nuanced philosophy through the decadent counterculture of the fin de siècle, and ultimately to Joyce's grand vision of a holistic Jew-Greek identity for his protagonists, and maybe for his nation.
What's truly fascinating here, and what this deep dive really shows, is how Joyce manages to take these seemingly separate elements, a specific medical term, a complex literary quote, a broad political and cultural ambition, and meticulously weave them into this incredibly dense, interconnected tapestry. And this tapestry doesn't just illuminate the complex inner lives of his characters, it casts this brilliant light on the cultural and political landscape of early 20th century Ireland. This deep dive shows us, yet again, that even the smallest, most seemingly random details in Ulysses are loaded with multiple profound layers of meaning, constantly inviting you, our listener, to look beyond the surface and engage with this magnificent text on so many intellectual and emotional levels.
So, as you reflect on Stephen's relentless struggle with self-perception and Ireland's complex, enduring need for cultural liberation and a balanced identity, maybe consider this provocative thought. In our own contemporary age, this age of overwhelming information and carefully curated online realities, are we, maybe like Caliban, sometimes afraid to truly see our own reflection in the unvarnished mirror of knowledge, perhaps preferring comfortable fictions? Or do we, like Joyce, strive to provide that nicely polished looking glass for ourselves and for others, even if it reveals uncomfortable, perhaps even painful truths that challenge our perceptions and force us to grow? What kind of mirror does our current culture, and indeed your own personal search for understanding, truly hold up for you?